Yes, welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV. Yes, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, the beginning of a brand new year and of course at the start of a new classic racing season. And while we're waiting on the new season getting up and underway, which I think will be around April time, we've still got quite a nice collection of bikes for you to take a look at. But of course our first indoor event of 2025 will be the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which will be coming up in early February. And if you can't make it this year, then of course you can see all of the bikes from that two-day event here on my channel soon after. Right, so let's crack on and take a look at another nice classic that I came across a couple of years back while I was attending a Scottish twin shock and evolution event. So let's dive in and take a look at this quite nice 1981 RM250 Suzuki. Yes, thanks once again for returning to Classic Dirt Bike TV with our second video posting of 2025, and we're going to continue to feature more of these old school classics right up until, of course, we attend the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which will be held on the 8th and 9th of February. And of course, soon after that show, you can see a nice selection of some of the bikes from the 2 days here on my YouTube channel. So it might be quite a good idea to subscribe at this moment in time so as that you don't miss out on all of those nice race bikes that I'll be highlighting from that Telford show. But anyhow, back to our featured bike, which is a rather nice looking 1981 RM250 Evolution Suzuki. And this particular model from Suzuki was quite innovative for the company in that year in at least two ways, because this RM250 was of course Suzuki's first ever motocross bike that had a single shock rear suspension, because you may remember that the previous 1980 RM was the very last of the twin shock motocrossers. But the other reason that makes this bike quite special was that it was also their first motocross model to feature their fantastic full floater rear suspension, but a little bit more about that later. But it was a few years ago now when I actually spied this bike sitting in the paddock while I was at a Scottish twin shock and evolution race event at Glenfarg near Perth. And as I recall, the bike at that time was being offered up for sale on the day, although whether it actually sold, I don't know. But it's not, of course, 100% original, as you can see, but nevertheless, it's still a very fine example of one of these early Evolution single rear shock air-cooled Suzukis, and a bike that you very seldom see at these kind of Evo race events. Now, at the time I grabbed these short series of video clips, I never had my DSLR stills camera with me at the time, so I never managed to get some of those super close-ups that we normally have a look at when we're checking out these vintage bikes. But this bike here was still certainly worthy of a quick look around here on my channel. But certainly this 1981 RM250 chassis was a brand new design for that year, and it had quite a large diameter front down tube and backbone on the chassis, which was quite heavily gusseted for added strength, and all of the tubes and the parts on the chassis were manufactured in chrome moly steel, and as you'd expect, it wasn't exactly a featherweight frame being made from steel, but this of course was the material that was commonly used to make all motorcycle frames in the 1980s, and an all alloy motocross chassis was still a good few years away yet. But this RM250 engine was another cracking powered unit from Suzuki that I think had a bore of about 67 millimeters and a stroke of about 70 mil, which I think roughly gave the engine a cubic capacity of about 244 cc's. But for a smaller 250 two-stroke, it was still a very good power unit, although naturally it wasn't as powerful as its bigger brother, the mighty 465. So to feed this Suzuki engine with its fuel, it was usually a 38mm Mikuni carburetor that mixed that fuel and air for the engine, and that mixture was fed through quite a large 8-petal reed valve block, and as I recall, I think those reed valve petals at that time were made of quite durable plastic. And this 250 also had quite a good sized plastic airbox that wrapped around that single rear shock, and it was also rubber mounted just to try and help with any vibrations. And inside it was a double foam type air filter with I think it had one on each side of that airbox, but the design and the air inlets for the filters were said to be one of the little niggles on this 81 RM, because it was always said that the RM motor just couldn't get enough air through the filters and airbox to feed that engine with its best mixture. And often riders would just open the top of the airbox to allow more air to flow, or another solution, of course, and probably one of the most popular, was to drill holes in the side of the airbox, as you can see here on our example. Now, it was a cable operated clutch on our 81 RM250, and it was a pretty stock standard oil cooled wet multi-plate unit that had a series of driven plates interlaced with several steel separator plates. And to connect that clutch to the crankshaft, it was a simple straight cut gear to link both the engine and the transmission together. And the clutch casing here on our 81 RM was also made of lightweight magnesium as well. And here on the other side of the engine, the RM250 also had quite a decent 5-speed gearbox, and to provide the sparks for that engine ignition, it was a modern style CDI, or capacitor discharge ignition unit, that was behind this little alloy ignition cover. Although despite that little problem of not being able to get enough air into the engine through the airbox, every other part on this Suzuki reed valve engine worked absolutely perfectly, and it did produce a decent amount of power, although what that official horsepower figure of this engine was, I can't recall offhand. But once you got around that lack of air into the engine, and you got all the other parts dialed in and working as they should, then this compact and powerful Suzuki engine could certainly make the bike fly. And basically this motor did exactly what it was built to do, and that was go fast and be reasonably reliable. But as I mentioned at the start of this video, our RM250 isn't a fully stock original bike with all of its factory parts still bolted onto it, which is what you'd expect on a 43-year-old off-road racer. And this exhaust expansion chamber, again, as you can see, is a pattern replacement, although from which manufacturer I'm not sure. But as you're aware, these expansion chambers are usually in the direct line of fire for any stones and other debris that gets thrown up from the track. So these parts do suffer quite a lot of damage, which is exactly why they were constantly being repaired, or as in our case here, replaced altogether. And again, this alloy tailpipe that you can see here is a quality D and G tailpipe, and who knows, maybe even that expansion chamber might be also a D and G item. But both of these parts will replace what would have been mild steel exhaust components that would have been bolted onto our RM back in 1981. But moving on to the Suzuki's front end, where we had a decent pair of 38mm forks, which, as I remember, I think gave the rider just over 11 inches of travel to work with here at the front end. And despite these forks having quite limited scope for making adjustments to the rebound and damping, these suspension units still worked very well for a relatively smaller 250 motocrosser. But you could still make minor adjustments to the operation of these forks by adding or removing air through the Schrader valves that were hidden underneath these rubber covers on the top of each fork leg. Although that process did very little with regards fine-tuning the forks' operation, but it did make them softer or harder depending on the rider's particular preferences. But even straight from the factory, these forks here still worked very well. And also, while we're here at the front end of the bike, it's worth mentioning that these Suzuki hubs and their front and rear brakes were another one of the very good points on our 81 Suzuki. And this 6-inch diameter hub had quite a good progressive braking action that had plenty stopping power, and it could quite easily stand the bike up in its front wheel whenever it was required. But it was just a stock standard front brake setup, and of course not a twin leading shoe affair, which the 250 in actual fact didn't need, because the standard braking setup worked just fine. And this hub's front brake backplate was also made of that lightweight exotic magnesium. And it was much the same story here with this rear brake and its performance, and the front and the rear hubs also had Suzuki's straight pull spoke setup. But our 81 bike, you can see, has been fitted with a brand new pair of gold anodized alloy SM Pro Platinum wheels, which again are a direct replacement to the Suzuki original. So the overall brake setup on our RM250 was every bit as you'd expect from a quality Japanese off-road motocrosser. Which brings us around to the rear suspension setup on our Evolution Suzuki, which was said to be the first ever year for Suzuki's fantastic full floater swing arm and suspension setup, because previously, as I said, for 1980 it would have still had the twin shock rear suspension at the back. And this sort of square box section alloy swing arm was just one part of the superb full floater rear suspension that was to be fitted to many other Suzuki models in the following years. And so basically what you had here was a single Monoshock suspension unit that had a kind of lever on the top and at the bottom of the shock that remotely connected that suspension unit to the bike. So it wasn't directly connected onto the chassis at the top or at the swing arm at the bottom. So hence its title of a full floater suspension system. But it did work absolutely perfectly, and in fact other bike manufacturers are still trying to copy its design because it was that successful, and without question it was Suzuki's full floater back end on their 81 bikes that was the best in the business. And even in this modern day, it was well ahead of its design and operation for a 1981 off-road dirt bike. And that single rear suspension shock had a remote reservoir to hold the gas and the oil for the suspension unit. And that canister was placed outside here at the side of the chassis, where the oncoming air could assist it in keeping it cool. Because when that full floater back end was being worked hard, the shock would certainly get quite hot, and the performance would tend to drop off. So anything that you could do to reduce the temperature of its contents would help in its operation. But this, of course, was 1981, and it was around this time that most dirt bike manufacturers were beginning to move away from those steel or alloy fuel tanks in favour of these much more lighter and more durable plastic fuel cells, which were also a lot cheaper to produce as well. And you could have these fuel tanks in any kind of shape and size or colour that you could imagine, but this plastic item here usually held just short of that 2.5 gallons of two-stroke pre-mix, so that was usually more than enough gas in this tank to keep our RM250 reed valve engine quite happy. Now, comfort-wise, our RM250 seat wasn't exactly brimming with deep, lush padding, so your crown jewels could certainly take a battering if it was a particularly bumpy track. Although, having said that, the full floater suspension system on this bike did iron out many of the bigger bumps that the bike would come across. So although this seat maybe not have been the most comfortable, that full floater back end still helped to make it a reasonably smooth ride. So up here in the bike's pilot seat, all of the controls, including the handlebars, are all brand new replacements for the original 1981 components, which again is only what you'd expect on a bike of this age, but the handlebar mounts were certainly rubber mounted onto that top triple clamp just to try and help remove any small shocks or vibrations that would be transmitted through the bars. And as far as I know, all of the cables and levers, and of course those lever covers, are all off-the-shelf stock standard parts that you'd find at your local off-road motorcycle shop. But the handlebars are probably a pair of modern-style rental items, which are a popular replacement to the original ones that were fitted to our bike back in the day. And all of the plastic parts on our RM, with maybe the exception of that fuel tank, are once again reproduction items that are a direct screw-on replacement to those Suzuki originals. But these side panels are, of course, minus their Suzuki yellow paint, which I can imagine would have made them a lot more expensive to buy if you wanted them painted. But the bike's front and rear plastic mudguards are virtually a universal yellow item that you could fit onto any number of off-road motocrossers. But for being a brand new model for Suzuki back in 1981, this was such a good bike, even straight out of the crate, and it was super competitive even the first time you put it on to the track, and that was without making any kind of adjustments to either the engine or suspension setups. Now, because our example here isn't a fully original bike, it does have a few replacement parts that is only to be expected from a bike of its age. But nevertheless, it's still a very good example of one of these innovative evolution Suzuki racers. So just to sum up, at the risk of repeating myself here, the chassis was made of steel, and although for 1981 we still didn't have those lighter alloy chassis that we have nowadays, it was still very strong and light enough to cope with anything that it would come across in that year. Now, the engine, as I said, on our 250 was an absolute belter as well, and it did make very good horsepower over the entire rev range. But possibly the best part of our 881 RM was that full floater rear suspension, which, although it was a brand new concept in that year, it was a design that worked extremely well straight off the drawing board, and allowed our 250 to absolutely float across bumps and obstacles that other bikes would find much harder to negotiate. And in fact, you may remember that 1981 was also the year that Suzuki introduced their first ever liquid-cooled motocross engine when they brought out that little yellow RM125 in the same year. So there was quite a lot going on for the Japanese company with regards innovation and brand new designs for 1981. Now, whether our particular RM250 actually got sold on the day that I filmed these clips, I don't know, but if it did sell, I'll certainly wager that the new owner is enjoying the speed and the handling and performance from this iconic motorcycle. Okay, so next up we're going to get ready to attend the 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, which is coming up in just a few weeks' time. So just to get us in the mood, we're going to take a look around a few Spanish bull tacos that I've filmed over the last few years at the show. So if you're into your bull tacos, then make sure that you come back, or better still, just subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on some of these superb looking machines. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that 81 RM250 Suzuki, and if these are the kind of bikes that you like to look at here on YouTube, then I do hope you'll come back very soon to see some more. So until my next video posting, thanks again for watching, and it's goodbye for now.